In this video, we're going to talk about a very important topic in React programming, and that is using child components and props. So that's the subject this time. We're starting with, once again, a blank create React app which we've generated. And so I'm going to go open up our typical component. This time I'm going to leave at least some of this stuff. So I'm going to take out this to get started message. Keep that header in there. Last video we talked about mapping. We're going to do the same thing today, except this time we're going to be making child components of the things we map. So last time we created a constructor so we could set up some default state. I'm going to start with the state from the last video. Let's see, there it is. So this, okay, so that looks right. We don't need the numbers and the strings. All we need are the people. So let's basically do what we did before. I'm going to create an unordered list. And this time I'm going to map through this .state.people. In return, let's just start with the index, which we don't have yet, so I'm going to put that here. So this is each person or each object one at a time. And then the index for that item, so this will start from 0 and move on up. And then let's just put the first name, and let's see what we get. Bob, Susan, and Frank. Okay, so that's how you map through. You have an array which has a function called map built in. This isn't a React thing, but React takes advantage of it. And so the map function takes another function. This is what is called a higher order function. It takes this other function and it passes in each item one at a time and an index. And the purpose of the map function is to iterate and transform. And so I'm essentially taking a bunch of objects which represent people and transforming them into components. And so each person becomes a separate list item, and so therefore we see what we see there. Okay? So that's the basic idea. However, what I want to do is talk about how you would take this bit of HTML and the other HTML we'll write and turn it into a child component. So let's flesh this out a little bit, because right now this is kind of bare bones. So let's just make it a little bit less bare bones. So first name, last name, age. All right, cool. So we have a list item rendered out with an H3 and a paragraph in each. What I want to do is I want to make a subcomponent for this and then pass in the data to the subcomponent. And so that way we can have this component that its whole job is to just render this list item. So let's do it. I'm going to create a new file called, I don't know, person item. So this is a JavaScript file. By default, Adam is going to treat this as a regular JavaScript file. I actually don't want that. I have the React plugin for Adam, just in case you haven't seen it. It looks like this right here. So this is what's actually handling all of the coloring and language support for React. Anyway, so I have made sure to set this file as a JSX file. So if we want to create another component, how do we do that? Well, the first thing is we need to import React from, well, React. So React was installed as a part of Create React App. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise. but this is the first time we're actually creating a component, and so we'll talk through the bits of this. Now, if you look at app.js at the top, it looks a little different. It imports React and component, and the reason why it separates this out is so that it can be used right here on line 5. You don't really have to do it that way. You can do it this way, and this is just personal preference. This will work just as well. It's totally up to you if you want to do it this way. So we here have a component. Every React component needs a render function. And now that I'm creating my first component, I can explain why you see a lot of people do this. Why are these parentheses here? And if we look here, we can see that, oh, you know what? Parentheses were used here. Let's get rid of them. I'll show you why we want them. So let's say we are rendering this list item that we had before. There it is. I'll just copy it. There it is. Let's get rid of this. Let's go just the HTML for now. And then we'll figure out how to actually get the data into this component. All right. So here's our component. This will actually work. I'll show you in a second why we need those parentheses, or why people often use them. But this will work as is, as a component. So we've imported React. We've created a class that extends React component. We give it a render function. The last thing is we need to export default person item. So now when we import this, we'll be able to use it. So let's see. Import person item from, there we go. See if we have any errors yet. No errors yet. So now let's use this instead of our block of HTML right there. Now the negative is, first of all, that we don't have any of the real data in there, but we'll get to how to pass that in here in a second. But you can see that this is working just fine. Now our key error will still be here, and the reason why is I got rid of the key. At first, when I was doing React and doing child components, I started trying to put the key here because this is where it was whenever we did it the other way. But that's not actually what you do. The key needs to be on the component itself, like so. And this is what's going to get rid of it. There we go. Error gone. Cool. So now we have our person item here, and we can explore how this component would work and how we would send data in. Let's go ahead and get that issue I wanted to bring up around parentheses out of the way. So we've seen this work. Let's do this. Okay, let's do this and see what happens. And if I save that, I come back and whoops, person item.render, a valid React element or null must be returned. You may have returned undefined, an array, or some other invalid object. That is correct. I have in fact returned undefined. And we might ask, well, why have I returned undefined? Well, it's because of something called automatic semicolon insertion. If I write the code this way, what happens is JavaScript will put a semicolon right there. And when it puts that semicolon right there, it basically returns undefined. And this code isn't even reached. And so that's why I'm getting that error, because I have in fact returned undefined. Now, as it says, I can return null, and that is technically valid. That's not what I want to do here at all. What I want to do is I want to return that list item. Well, one thing that people commonly do is to force JavaScript to make sure that everything here will get returned. They wrap everything in parentheses. And so now JavaScript will be sure to return this entire expression. And so therefore we can put the list item here and line these up. I like this style a lot. I think you'll see it a lot in the wild. And so now it will work again. So that's why you will see these parentheses here. They are not strictly required, but they do make it a little bit easier to format. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and figure out how to get data passed into the component. So if we come out here, we can pass data in like so. I'm going to create a property named firstName and then pass in person.firstName. What happens is this value will be put in an object called props, and then that will be inserted into the object. Let's see that in the console. So here we go. We had 3 items in the array, and so all 3 items will get rendered. And if I look at this .props, I can see, look, there's Bob was the first one, Susan second, and Frank third. So what that means is I can, if I want to, do this. And that works. That works just fine. If I want to, I can also then pass in last name. So let's go back here, this .props.last name, and that should work fine. And it does. Fantastic. And then finally, we could put in age, but eventually we might get annoyed and go, you know what? It sure would be easier if instead of passing in each property individually, we could just pass in the object. So let's do that. You don't have to pass in simple values. You can do this. So if we look at the props, we can see person, and then all the properties that came with it. So that means we can go to our person item and say this.props.person, there. And then we can just use the age. All right, obviously I messed this up. What did I do? Well, you know, as far as React is concerned, this is just text until I wrap it in curly brackets. There we go. Okay, cool. So let's see. I've extracted everything into a subcomponent. I've passed the data in as props. All that works fine. Let's do one other thing, and that is how would I create a CSS file for this component? We've sort of just been using the existing CSS. We haven't done anything with it. So I'm going to show you real quick how this works. This right here is a Webpack thing, and so see this import app.css. Well, app.css is this file, and this is the one that gets created with create React app. I can create a new one called person item.css, and I'm going to create a class called person item. And I'm going to put this on the list item, so I can list style type none, and I can give everything a border, and I want to put a little bit of margin on the top and the bottom. So how would I include this into the application? Well, by default, the way they're leading you down here is to do this. So come in here and say import person_item.css, and let's take a look, and nothing seemed to get applied, which is actually correct because I forgot to do something. I created this class called person_item and I never actually attached it to the list item, so I'm going to do this. You can't do this class equals because class is a keyword in JavaScript, and JSX is this weird combo between JavaScript and HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make it class name, and this is special for React because class is a special word in JavaScript. It's basically going to transform class name into class when it actually gets output in the HTML. So I can do person item here, and now I hope, and there it is, there's that CSS apply. Now I have all of this space over here on the left that's actually not from these list items. Now this is actually from the unordered list here, because by default unordered list and ordered list have a padding left on the inside of them, and this is just the way it's been for a long time, so we can take that out. Now I actually have to remind myself if it was a UL or an OL, and it is a UL, so we can say UL padding left 0. Now that'll go away. Excellent. Okay, so I have my 3 components. What have we done? We extracted these components into child components, like so. They look sort of like the other component that we've been messing around with. They have a class and they extend React component. They have a render function. Same basic pieces go into this. All these React components are made, generally speaking, in this way. And so we have this child component that we are using in the other component right here. We import that child component, and then it essentially becomes an XML or an HTML element within the rendered output. You can see I just took that name I imported and then put the less than and the greater than sign and the closing and all that, and put it in, and just boom, React just makes that work. That's how their component model works. It's kind of cool. So that's how I created my child component, and then I passed this person in to person item. And so in here, that whatever attribute and data that comes in is put into something called props. And props is something that is sent from the parent element, which is, or parent component, which is app.js, into the child component, which is person item. Unlike state, you actually don't change props. You don't change it over time like we did in a previous video. This is actually what is called immutable. These props are only to be changed by the parent component when they're passed in, or when the component is created. That's how they get changed. You don't change them within this component. But that's for another time. That will we'll need a little bit more complex interactions of state and whatnot to see that in action, how that works. But that'll come in a later video. So for now, I believe that is it. If you have any requests for covering any particular topics in React, feel free to put them in the comments below.